All right, so good morning, students. Welcome to our November Virtual Career Cafe. I'm Amy Goode from the Community Education Center for Elk-Cameron counties, and I'll be your moderator for today. We are recording the session and making it available for students to view later. Today's session is to provide you an opportunity to learn about careers in the tech industry. And today we have Skylar Surra, a principal animator at Riot Games, who currently works in the R&D space building prototypes for future game projects, and Kaitlyn Goode, an independent Geographic Information Systems consultant. So welcome. Thank you both for joining us today. I am going to start off with Skylar and ask you some questions. So do you want to start off just sharing your background and journey in the field of video game animation? What inspired you to become an animator in the gaming industry?
Sure. So I actually grew up in northern Pennsylvania in Shingle House. I went to school, was homeschooled, and then went to school at Oswego Valley. That's actually Bob Wicker's in this meeting. He was my principal growing up when I was in high school. That's kind of the connection here. But I was always kind of into art growing up and through high school. I did a lot of drawing. And I think inspiration wise, some of my biggest inspirations growing up were seeing the Lord of the Rings movies, and the Star Wars prequels kind of came out in the 90s when I was a teenager. And I went and saw those movies, and those are kind of some of the first movies that heavily used, like CG special effects and stuff. And at that time, I really wanted to get into the film industry doing like special effects kind of work. I actually went to school after high school. I went to college to study 2D animation, and I kind of had like dreams of getting into Disney. So I studied like actual hand-drawn 2D animation. We drew on paper and took actual photos of the work. This was before it was all digitized and stuff. So it was kind of old school. Unfortunately, in that time I was there in school, that kind of got phased out as an art form. I mean, Disney shut down their whole 2D animation department. DreamWorks shut down most of it. And I know they've kind of come back, but at that time it was like the whole industry pretty much died and went away during the time that I was in college. So I came out the other end of that kind of confused about what to do. There was no jobs in this thing that I had a degree in. And all through this time, I had played video games growing up. I played StarCraft and Warcraft 3 and World of Warcraft and, tons of video games, Zeldas, everything you can imagine growing up. And as I sort of looked into 3D animation as a possible career choice, I sort of noticed people coming out of the schools getting jobs in games. And honestly, up until that point, I hadn't really considered a job in the games industry. It was always film. I wanted to get into film. But when I started to poke around it a bit, animation in the game industry seemed pretty appealing. Like jobs were a bit more stable. Everything was a little bit more relaxed. You weren't like going from film to film trying to beg for a job every year. And so anyways, I applied to a bunch of game studios coming out of Animation Mentor, which was like an online animation school that I did to learn 3D animation. I got a little job up in Rhode Island at a studio called 38 Studios working on an MMO. Unfortunately, that didn't work out. They went bankrupt, but I kind of piggybacked off that to a job at Riot, and I've been there ever since. I worked on League of Legends, which is kind of their flagship product, for a couple years, and then moved into their R&D department. And that's where I've been ever since, working on, as you said, new game concepts, none of which the things I've worked on have been released. So I've been working in that for almost 8 years and been through like a slew of interesting projects that either got canceled, rebooted, or are still being worked on. So maybe someday you'll see something that I've worked on. So.
Well, that has to be disappointing, I guess. How do you keep moving on?
Yeah, it's interesting because during that time I've got to work on some very exciting things. So I guess you kind of have to have the mentality of it being about the journey, not the destination. And actually, that's a lot of the game industry. So many products get canceled before they ever see the light of day. I mean, I read articles every day about studios shutting down and products getting canceled. And I think that people working in the game industry just have to have a little bit of a thick skin and just really enjoy the actual job of making those things. It is obviously exciting. You want to like release something and have the players see it and play it and be excited about it. But for me personally, I don't know, I kind of like the problem solving aspect and I really enjoy doing the day-to-day animation. So at least for me, while it is demoralizing a bit to have like a product get canceled, I am often just excited to like move on to the next thing. That's not for everybody. I don't know that everybody wants to work like 8 years and not actually like make anything that players get to play. But other than a bummer in the moment, it hasn't been a huge like turn off for me to that career.
So how long do you work on one before realizing this isn't going to work? And how do you figure that? How do you realize, okay, this isn't going to work?
Yeah, it's interesting. Usually it's not really, I mean, I shouldn't say it's not in our control. It's not our decision. So how the R&D department at Riot at least works is we generally work on a prototype for about a year, and then it sort of has like a go, no go call at that point. If they decide they want to continue with it, there's a few options. It could either, yeah, we really love it, let's just keep making it like it is. But more often, it's one of the other two decisions, which is either they just cancel it because it's not working out for one reason or another, or they like sort of redirect it and say like, oh, we want to work on this more, but we want to sort of like massage it in a little bit of a new direction. That conversation is a conversation between us, and there's like a R&D leadership group that sort of is a panel, almost like a panel of designers and artists and leaders of the company who are sort of making decisions about the portfolio of games that Riot wants to release. And so we're kind of in constant communication with them. So I'd say that a game getting canceled or rebooted or redirected isn't usually a big surprise. Usually, while it's a bummer, a lot of times the team that's working on it also agrees that it's not going in the right direction. And that's not really like a failure of the team very often. More often than not, it's things like, oh, this game we were working on, somebody else in the time we were working on it actually released a really good version of it. And it's just not really worth the company investing millions of dollars into making a game that now already kind of exists. Or it may be, hey, we kind of wanted to do a spin on an already existing genre, and we spent the year trying to prove out that that was a direction worth pursuing. But then at the end of the day, when we look at it, it's like, yeah, we weren't able to like make it interesting enough to deserve a whole new game in this genre or something like that. So a lot of times it is very like exploratory work, and the goal isn't necessarily always to ship a game at the end of it. A lot of times it's to try to discover if there's the opportunity to ship a game in that space. And so usually the things that sort of go forward at the end of that process are things that everybody kind of agrees are like, oh, this is innovative enough that it kind of deserves us wanting to spend more money and kind of fund it through pre-production and production. So I would say it's actually more frequent for games to get canceled or rebooted or redirected than it is for them to sort of go forward after that year.
So how big is or small is Riot Games? How many, employees?
Oh gosh, I actually don't know that. I think they're over 5,000 people now.
Wow.
So Riot Games is a kind of weird company. They obviously make games, so they have like a pretty big team that still works on League of Legends, which has been out now for 12, 13 years or something like that. So it's like a live game. They release new champions, new skins and stuff for it every couple of weeks. They also have a pretty large team that works on Valorant, which is kind of their newer big product. That's like a tactical shooter game where you go around and try to disarm bombs and that kind of thing. And then we have a couple other products that we have. So I would say of those 5,000 people, if I was to guess, I'd say that maybe 1,000 to 1,200 of them work on actual games. And then the rest of them are like running esports, and we have like a whole media branch that is doing like think projects like Arcane, which is like the League of Legends show that was on Netflix. And there's a whole audio department that does like music for the company. We have like a whole sort of like Riot music label thing. And so the company is kind of now become a big like multimedia company. And because of that, it's expanded into all these different branches, which have tons of people. Don't quote me on the exact number of the employees. I don't actually know, but I think we have this little thing internally where you can put in your name and see how many Riot employees were hired after you were hired. And I've been there for about 11 years, and it's like 90, I think 98.3% of the company was hired after me. So I don't know like what that means in the grand scheme of things, but it's crazy to have been there that long and seen it grow so big. So
Yeah, I bet. So when you say you're working on a team, like, do you work with the same team all of the time, or does it depend on like what game you're working on, or how does that work?
yeah, so I get assigned to a game project. So I do work with like the same, I do work on the same project all the time, unless it gets like canceled or whatever, and I move on to a new one. But so for example, right now I'm working on a project with what about 60 or 70 people. And on a day-to-day basis, though, I work with different groups of people constantly. So how we sort of organize the project is it's split up into milestones. So we'll plan maybe a 10-week milestone, and we'll say, hey, we want to make this character and these things and so on and so forth. And we sort of all agree on what we want to make for the milestone. And then but we only have on our team uh, four other animators other than myself. So there's 5 of us in total. And there's a lot of projects. So what happens is we get sort of like hopped around to work on all these different projects through the milestone. So I might spend 2 weeks working with, you know, a designer, an engineer, and a VFX artist on one thing, and we'll work on that for 2 weeks. And then the next 2 weeks, I'm working with like a different designer, an engineer, and animator on like a different part of the same project. So I actually move around a lot and work with a lot of different groups of people, but all on the same project. I don't usually hop off and work on like other games. I'm most of the people at the studio are sort of like nested on one game project, and then you sort of move around with different groups, smaller groups of people to work on different like sub projects within that larger project.
So how are you communicating with all these people? Like what's, I don't know, out there in California, what's the
Yeah. No, it's a great question. So it's honestly changed a huge amount over the past couple of years. I mean, it used to be before the pandemic, we would all go in the office. We'd have what we called stand-ups every morning, where we'd all physically get together in the same room and talk through what we were all going to be working on for the day, make sure that everyone was sort of updated on the progress. Like one of the most challenging things of game development is that you can't really make anything yourself. Like as an animator, I can make the character move, but oftentimes I need the help of other disciplines to actually cook that up to something in game to make it work, and vice versa. You know, a designer can make something, but they can't make it move without me and like look correct. And so the environment is incredibly collaborative, and it's incredibly important that everybody kind of knows the status of everything almost every day. In the office, that was a little easier in some ways, because you could just literally turn around your chair and ask somebody if you were waiting on something. That's definitely changed over the past couple of years. I'm fully remote now. I actually live in upstate New York. I work on like California hours, which is kind of weird. So I work from like 1 o'clock to 8 o'clock. But now, I mean, we still have that same format. We still meet in the morning every day to discuss the status of work and everything like that and have a stand up, but it's all digital. We do that all on like Discord, Zoom, and Google Meets for various different things. Those have different benefits. And then we do a good amount of our communication over Slack as well. That's like a common sort of company text chat thing. So a lot of just things where I'm like, hey, I have a status update on this. We have big Slack channels that you post like, oh, I'm working on this category of stuff, so I'll post this update here. It's a little bit more challenging to keep track of everything in the digital world just because there's so many avenues that they're coming at you. You know, there's like the people talking on voice chat and who want to talk that way. There's some people who like to communicate solely via text, and they don't, they don't ever want you to see their face. And so it's been sort of interesting trying to adapt that like collaboration to a fully digital environment. It's very possible. I mean, we've been working this way now for 3 or 4 years, but it definitely did take a lot of adaptation from the just like I could ask you over my shoulder kind of situation we had before. I personally like it. It allows me to work remote and kind of live where I want, which was a huge thing for me personally. But it hasn't jived with everybody. A lot of people still really like that. And I mean, I still like the in-person collaboration, but having to live exclusively in like California or something just was not something I personally wanted. But yeah.
All right. So what kind of software and tools are you using for this, for your creations?
Yeah, so I use two primary tools for animation, for the actual creation of animation. Most of the industry uses Maya. Unfortunately, Maya is a very expensive product, and it's a little bit hard to get your hands on as like a student if you want to learn it. So I often recommend people check out Blender. Blender is actually a free 3D animation suite that can do just about everything and some more than Maya. And has been kind of like it's kind of moving to, I don't know if it'll ever become the industry standard, but like a lot of indie studios and stuff are using Blender as like an alternative to Maya just because it's cheap and free. You literally go download it now, and there's millions of tutorials out there on how to learn it. For the actual making of the game, so we animate in one piece of software. I'll build like the motion of the character and stuff in Maya, but then we export it and we have what we call a game engine. And so the game engine is what we use to like cobble all the different millions of little pieces together to run the logic for the game, to, let's say, take 1,000 animations of different like little movements, jumps, hops, runs, climbs, etc. And we assemble those all in the game engine using code, or in the case of Unreal, a sort of like visual blueprinting where it's all these little nodes that attach to each other with a bunch of rules. So we use mostly the Unreal Engine. The sort of two big industry standard engines are Unreal and Unity. They both are, great. I prefer Unreal. It's a little bit easier to use. And then the last sort of suite of software that I use daily is the Adobe software. So like Photoshop, Illustrator. I do have to do a lot of stuff where I occasionally we'll have to fix colors on characters and that kind of thing. So being able to like pull textures and things into like Photoshop or something and tweak them and fix them is something that I kind of do occasionally. Not so much 2D stuff these days with me, but that is sort of the other suite of software we use a lot.
So technology advances quickly. So how do you keep up with all of the advances?
Yeah, this is a great question. I'd say this is probably one of the hardest things about the industry is that it just feels like every day there's something new and exciting coming out technology wise. When I was first starting in the industry, it kind of stressed me out, honestly, a lot, like thinking about, I got to keep up, got to keep up. The reality is that game projects take so long to make now that a lot of times you're not able to even take advantage of the advancements that are happening while you're making the project, because you often have to make a lot of commitments up front about how you're making a thing. You have to kind of decide what engine you're using. A lot of times you even have to decide what version of an engine you're using. So if while you're making a game, they come out with, like right now we're on Unreal 5, for example, if they decide to come out with Unreal 6 and it has all these new features, the likelihood of us even switching over and being able to use it on like a current project that we're working on is pretty slim. So a lot of times these sort of technology advancements happen and you sort of have like a beat to sort of invest in and look at them at the beginning of projects. And so like the project I was working on that I'm working on now, a few years ago when we started it, I did a bunch of investigation into, hey, what are the new animation systems? What is, at that point, we were switching from like Unreal 4 to Unreal 5. I learned a bunch about Unreal 5, followed all the tutorials to see what new animation systems and stuff there were. So that's kind of when we do it. But where the resources, I mean, there's a couple of really great resources that I am always looking at. One is there's conference called GDC. It's the Game Developers Conference. That's kind of a treasure trove of the latest tech. So most games that have sort of come out in the previous year that were kind of big games that either created or invested in new technology go there and do sort of TED-style tech talks about the things that they created. So that's like a great inspiration to kind of see what the cutting edge studios are doing technology wise. The hard thing is that a lot of times they'll show stuff there and you'll be like, oh, that's so exciting. I want to get that on my project. But it's almost never they're while they're sharing what they did, it's not like they're telling you how to make it. They're like, here's the cool thing that we made, and they'll talk about the ins and outs of it. But at the end of the day, you kind of, if you wanted to do something similar, you have to rebuild it yourself. So an example of this is several years ago, Epic, which makes the Unreal Engine, they had a game called Paragon, and they built these really cool like split body systems where the characters could do something with their upper body while running around with their lower body that I was really inspired by. And I was like, I want to do that in my game, right? And you can't just take that and put it in your game. I had to work with engineers to completely rebuild it from scratch. So we like scoured the video where they talked about how they made it, and we came up with our own ideas about how to produce similar things in our game. And so it really is this like, you look at what they're doing, but then you still have to like problem solve it almost in the same way that they did, because things don't just like, you can't just take something from one game and plug it into another game. Usually the environments of like what you're making are often so different that's just not possible.
So, what are some like skills or qualities that, if students are looking to go into this video game, animation, or any type of game design position, what can they start in high school, to work towards that?
Yeah. So I know a lot of people want to hear just play games, but that's part of it. Like, you should, if you want to work in the game industry, you should play games and be sort of up to date on what's out there. And even for you, just sort of like figure out what kind of games you might be excited about making, because there's like so many studios out there that are making different kinds of games. But I always tell people, you can't just play games. You also have to some extent, be making games or making game tangential things. And what I mean by that is, there's a lot of games that have like modding systems where you can sort of learn how their game works and make mods of the game. Like a good example of this is Minecraft. Minecraft now is probably like the most modded game in the world. So you can go in and you can make your own versions of the characters, and you can learn how to put new textures and materials on the things in the game. And those sort of games that have this modding aspect to them are great ways to learn about game development in a way that's a little softer than just trying to like build everything yourself from scratch. So I actually encourage people to check out games like Minecraft, check out games like Roblox. I know that's like a little bit of a younger audience of games, but they have like a great modding setup for that. I think Unreal just released like a modding system for Fortnite, which is maybe even one of the best ways to learn, because it literally uses like the Unreal Engine. And so that, I think, is, as sort of a high school level student, one of the best things you could do is start investigating like the modding communities and just kind of poke around and see how games work and how you sort of edit the elements of them. If you go to school somewhere and actually like learn how to like one of these disciplines, they'll teach you all the like really complex and nuanced like way to do it. But as far as just sort of getting into it, the sort of modding communities are the sort of easiest access point. And then I think the other piece of advice I have is just try to get involved in some of the like professional communities around game development. So go check out and follow people on like LinkedIn. I know LinkedIn is often sort of categorized as like a professional site, and it is, but at least in the creative industry, it's almost like a social media and sharing site as well. So you can go on there and see what animators are actually doing in the industry. They post lots of stuff there. Designers post things that they're working on. And so it's a great way to see what like professional level people are doing in the game industry, because even as a student, you always want to be looking toward what professional level artists or game developers are doing, because when you try to apply for a job, you're not going to be evaluated as like a student, you are going to be evaluated as a professional. And so your work does need to be to some extent like comparable with working professionals who are in the industry when you start applying for jobs. So being sort of in that LinkedIn space and seeing what more like professional level folks are posting and doing in that world is a great way to kind of see and have like a target to aim for.
So what like education wise is required for this? Is it like a full 4-year bachelor's degree, or is it a technical school, or what are they looking at?
Yeah, it actually depends pretty vastly on the discipline that you're in. So making games requires a bunch of different people with different expertise. You have like engineers who are essentially software coders. You have designers who are the people like actually designing like what you do in the game, and then there's a whole bunch of creatives. There's animators, there's narrative, there's VFX artists, there's character artists, there's tech artists, and so on and so forth. Some of those jobs, particularly the ones that are more technical, like engineering, definitely require like a bachelor's degree in like computer sciences with like a focus in coding. You just need to go learn how to do that. That's like just the reality of the world. And so like the nice thing about that though is that those sort of skills, software engineering, if you go specialize in that, it's a pretty broadly applicable skill set. You can go into games, you could go work for a Google, you could go work for a Facebook, any sort of place that makes software can utilize those kind of skills. So if you just want to like get into the tech industry, going kind of that route is definitely the sort of like best way to kind of get your foot in that door. On the other hand, the creative jobs often don't have any requirements associated with them beyond your actual portfolio that you submit. So, for example, I know many artists who had no college experience, who either learned themselves, went to trade schools, or self-learned in some cases. For example, while I did go learn 2D animation and get like a bachelor's degree, that's had almost no impact on my career. The actual thing that sort of got in my jobs was what I learned afterwards by taking that online animation school I mentioned. I did that. That was like a 1.5-year program called Animation Mentor. It was an online animation school where they sort of connected you with working industry animators who helped you give feedback on the sort of like animation tests and stuff you were building. So what I encourage people to do is really try to decide as much as they can on a sort of area that they want to specialize in. There's not really like a concept anymore so much in the game industry of generalists who are just sort of game developers. Everybody is something. They're an engineer, they're an animator, they're a character artist, they're a VFX artist, and really go learn that thing. And I would say that particularly for the arts, I would investigate really focused sort of like trade school options before I would go get like a full-on like bachelor's degree in art. I don't want to dissuade people from going to college. I know that's like, people are like, don't tell my kids not to go to college. But the reality is you can go do a program like Animation Mentor and it can cost $15,000, or you could go to an art school and pay $150,000. And so if you can kind of try it out and see if it's like an expertise or a discipline that you're actually interested in and committing to for a price that's not going to break the bank, I always encourage people to go that route first. And then if you feel like you need more, then maybe consider college in these sort of creative disciplines. So I'm not saying don't go to college. I'm just saying investigate what options are out there other than college, because I see a lot of students who like go to college for 4 years and then realize that it's not really what they wanted to do. And then they've invested so much money in it that they can't really explore alternatives. Whereas a lot of these online creative schools now provide a great, like cheaper way for you to try something out without it being like a career ending choice if you don't end up liking it. Like if you go to an animation school and you spend $5,000 to go to a first semester and then decide I don't really want to do that and then go do VFX or something instead, you haven't like locked yourself out of that because you spent so much money on school already. So
that's great advice. Great advice. Well, I'm going to go out to the students now and see if anyone has any questions at this point. Anybody have any questions? If they don't have questions, that means I did my job and, I asked the right ones, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll let them stew on that.
Hey, Amy, I have a question.
Oh, okay.
I have just a quick question.
Yeah.
Is your job salaried or is it per project, or how are you, like, what is the pay structure?
Oh yeah. No, that's a great question.
Thank you.
So my job is salaried. So I just get a salary per year. I'm supposed to work like core hours is what they call it, which is there's sort of like a core section of 5 hours a day where everybody at the studio is supposed to be there. How you sort of work your other hours, I mean, generally most people just work like an 8-hour block in the day, but there is some amount of flexibility. Now that's my job. That's not true of the entire industry. I've been working in this position now for 10 plus years. The job that I had previously, and this is not uncommon for sort of first-time jobs, the job I had previously was actually a contract position. So what that means is that I was actually like a temp is kind of how you think of it in the rest of the world, where I had 1 year of guaranteed work, and I actually would have to like clock in and get paid hourly and everything like you sort of think of like a normal like hourly job. There's a lot of contract work in the game industry. Those jobs tend to be a little bit easier to get because they have like an end time, and that they also have like the risk associated with them that like when your contract ends, you might not have a job anymore. You might need to look for another one. So a lot of times looking for like a contract position in the industry is a great way to kind of get your foot in the door, even if it doesn't come with that sort of dependability. Now, the game industry is kind of unique in this sort of creative, particularly animation space, because one of the few places where you even can get salaried positions. If you go into animation and film, there are very, very few salaried positions. Almost every single job in like the film and animation industry are like contract oriented. So you get like hired for the project. And that's what I had mentioned kind of earlier, is that was one of the big like turnoffs to me to the film industry when I found out about that, was just hearing a lot of professional film animators who were basically every time a movie ended, they had to like reapply for their own job. So even if you were working at like DreamWorks or Disney or something, you may work on a film for like whatever, 1.5 years, 2 years. And then at the end of that, your contract ends. And if you want to work on the next film at DreamWorks or Disney, the same studio we're just working at, you have to like reapply for the next film. And so it is kind of like it's a hard loop to live with that sort of like lack of job security. And it really stressed a lot of people out. That was one of the reasons that, and is one of the reasons that I encourage a lot of people to look at the game industry, because it actually offers a little bit higher quality of life as far as you can get salary positions better and faster, and that leads to you just having a little bit more job security in general.
So we have a question at Frets. How do you learn how to code?
Yeah, so coding is, so when I was talking about engineering and software engineering, that's actually coding. So engineers and software engineers, those are that's a discipline at the studios that are primarily focused on coding. To learn that is one of the few disciplines that I would recommend going to school for. There's like a clear path to learning coding and learning coding languages. So going and looking at schools that have like computer science degrees with a focus in like software engineering is generally what I would advise. As far as like what can you do in like high school, there are huge amounts of like online resources to learn basic coding and familiarize yourself with that. I mean, honestly, I just go to YouTube, find a course on there and follow it. There's so many good resources on learning coding languages. I'd say like my son, and this is going to sound silly, but he's like really into modding Minecraft, Java Minecraft, and learning how to mod Java edition Minecraft. It basically teaches you how to Java code. So there's lots of, if you get into that modding world and also just kind of look on YouTube for coding, there's lots of resources out there, even as like a high school student for free, that you can go and kind of dabble in coding. And then long term, I would recommend looking into sort of schools where you can learn that at a more professional level.
Kaitlyn also added in the chat that Google has free coding courses.
They do.
Does code.org, and Microsoft has coding courses also.
Yeah, the other thing that I'd mention is there's another great resource called Scratch, which it's like a visual coding language where you can kind of learn about coding using like a block building system. And that is like a fantastic way to just sort of like very entry level kind of look at and understand how code works. It doesn't necessarily teach you a language that's used by professionals because it's like its own little thing, but it teaches a lot of the like logic and thinking methods for getting into coding in a way that is great for like visual learners who might be intimidated by like, oh, I have to like type it all out and it's like a giant block of text. It's more like these little like Lego blocks that have all the logic rules and stuff that you can snap together and build stuff.
Very good. All right. I think we're gonna move on to Kaitlyn, and then we'll come back at the end if they thought of any more questions for you, Skylar. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, Kaitlyn. So now I'm gonna introduce Kaitlyn Goode. But the first thing, Kaitlyn, that everybody I think wants to know is what GIS is and how it's used in like real world applications, like before you jump into your career. Because the question for me I get is like, well, what is GIS? So if you want to start off with that.
Yes, and sorry, I have laryngitis for everybody who is attending. I'm also local, so if you want me to ever come in, talk any other times, just let us know. But GIS is Geographic Information Systems, and so it's basically making maps online using a software. You can make interactive and static maps, and I can share some examples later too, and I can share my portfolio as well to show you the different interactive and static maps that I've made. And it's all about data visualization and analysis with data to kind of just get into just a little bit of it.
So do you want to talk about like your background a little bit, like what inspired you to, pursue GIS as a career, as one of them?
One of them. Yeah, my career path is not linear. I went to my undergrad for meteorology and emergency management. I got 2 degrees in 4 years. And then I got my master's online in GIS in, I think, 3 years. And that was through Penn State. And that was during COVID and it was all online. And I kind of just been making myself my own path from there. And I did an internship down in Pittsburgh with GIS. And then it kind of introduced me into the consulting sort of world and kind of doing it on my own to stay up to date on my skills.
Do you want to explain a little bit about your Pittsburgh internship? I think that might explain a little bit like in the real world, like how it's being utilized in the real world.
Yeah, actually here, I'll share my screen and show. So through PWSA, which is Pittsburgh Water and Sewer, they make different maps for the utilities. And one of the ones that they make for the public is their projects. And so it's an interactive map. You can click on the projects. It'll tell you the name, the location, the status. And it's just this is just one of the maps that they make. We make static maps for I think it's for PA 511, which is where it's like the call before you dig. And those are static maps that we send out to people. And that's how they are able to see where the utility lines are located.
So how do you collect and analyze the data? And what are some potential challenges that you run into?
So some of the way that we collect data is by surveying, GPS, or hand inputting the data, which can take like hours to do if you're hand inputting data, depending on the amount of data that you have. We also get a lot of our data publicly online through like data portals, usually ran through county, state, and also federal have data portals as well. And that's just another way we get our data.
And how do you ensure that the data you work with is accurate, up to date?
Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you know because they'll put the year and they'll tell you what it is. And unfortunately, if you are looking for up-to-date data, you are kind of left to make a couple of choices. One, not use the data at all. Two, just suck it up and use the data, even if it's a little bit out of date. Or three, you have to go in and put your own data if that's an option that you can do. So the data doesn't get updated a lot if you're doing county data in a smaller county, but like federal data will usually get updated yearly, which is usually good, but sometimes it doesn't. And so you just have to look at what they call the metadata, and that will tell you when it's been updated and when the data was collected.
So what software are you utilizing?
I use Esri, which is a suite of products, and it's specifically called ArcGIS, and there's a desktop version and an online version. It is kind of expensive for people that are just looking to get into it, but there is a free version called QGIS, and it's free for anybody to download, and it's very similar to the Esri suite of products. It's just a little different in some of their stuff, but that's a way that people can get into GIS at a younger age. And there's a lot of tutorials online for QGIS too.
So what are like the skills and qualifications, to do this type of job? Is it like, an associate degree, bachelor's degree, or no degree?
So unfortunately, GIS is a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. So you do have to go to college for it. And some of the skills you really would like is computer skills, coding. Unfortunately for me, I'm not that big of a coder, but I'm learning. But you can still do the job and not know coding, but you just need to know a little bit. And so I always recommend coding skills for high school because it will impact you in a ton of other jobs too. And also problem solving. And you have to really love research and data and like digging through hours of data. And I love it, but some people might find that boring.
So how do you see the future of GIS evolving? Opportunities for young professionals or students that want to enter the field?
I think it's getting easier to be able to use GIS as like a teaching tool. I have some lessons that I like to do that are really easy for high school students to use through Google, which is really nice. And I think that it's kind of getting a kickstart in all of the kind of fields and jobs in the world. Mapping data is visual. People like seeing visual things. They like interacting with things. So I think you'll be seeing more and more of this mapping and interactive apps and interactive maps as we progress. I thought geography and GIS was a dying skill, but come to learn out that GIS is a growing field and there's going to be jobs for GIS in the future, even more probably than there is now.
All right. Is there anything additional you wanted to add that I didn't ask?
Not at the moment, as I cannot speak very well. But okay, if you would like to say something about my job, you may go right ahead.
No, I'm good. Does anybody have any questions for Kaitlyn about GIS?
Oh, wait, I do have one thing that I want to share. So I highly, highly recommend, no matter what field you're in, that you build yourself an online portfolio. So I made mine through Google just because it was free and I had time to do it. But within my portfolio, I just put a little bit about me, And this is where I put all of my maps, where I did academic in school and in my professional field. And so I have my interactive maps, which my big one is my Allegheny County climate impacts tools. And this is a web application that I made for my master's project that is being utilized within Allegheny County at the moment. And so this is just a way that you can give to people your portfolio of skills and get to see. I mean, this is good for anything artists, you know, if you're going into the arts, going into any type of degree. I put my professional posters in here from my professional conferences. So just anything that you do and anything that you make, just put in a professional virtual profile. It's easier for you when you're applying for jobs because their jobs have so many different requirements. And you're like, well, I'll pull this from here and pull this from here. And so I also have my resume on here too, so that it's like, I don't have to keep it to one page. It's like, oh, here's every single thing that I did if somebody's interested in seeing that. So that one I highly, highly recommend.
Great advice. Great advice. All right. Does anybody have any questions for either of our guests? Skylar, was there anything I didn't ask about that you wanted to, do you have anything additional you wanted to add that I didn't ask?
I didn't have anything specific, but can I ask Kaitlyn a question?
Sure.
I'm interested in this. So when you're building the maps, obviously, even on your portfolio site, there's quite a few different like visual formats you're using. How do you decide how to present the information? Obviously, you're making some sort of decisions about like what it should look like in the visual hierarchy of it and stuff. And I feel like it has a lot of crossover with like, you know, some of the visual stuff that even I'm doing. I'm curious how you decide how to present the information. Is there like a skill set around visual hierarchy and stuff there?
There is. In school, we learn a lot about like visuals and aesthetics when you're making and creating maps. So I do say that I love art. So this was a great like crossover between art and science. It's like you get to do both. And it's a lot of what I like to say user engagement too. Like you need to take your users into consideration and being like, who are my users? What data and things do they need to know and what is important and how can I represent that in a way that people are going to understand? And that is a huge part of my job. I would send like 40 emails to my consultant that I'm working with right now, just literally about color. And I'm like, okay, is this color okay? Like, do you like this? Does it look okay? Because it's like, they don't have the mapping background that I have. So it's like, to me, it might look like I understand it because of course I made it, but to them, I'm like, do you understand what I'm trying to convey? And so I'm big into the user engagement, big into user needs. That was actually a whole other internship I did, but on the weather side of things too. So yeah, it's very art and science.
That's awesome. It reminds me a lot of, I work with in the game industry, we call them the UI artists that do like the overlay over the screen. That's like where your buttons and all this stuff are. And it's similar, now that I'm hearing it, it's like similar in concept. You're trying to figure out how to draw the eye of the viewer to the thing that's the most interesting and most important on the screen and stuff. Very cool.
100%. And it's funny that you work for Riot and some of the games you were mentioning my fiance plays. And I'm like, ooh, and I'm always like, look at the maps. Like Legend of Zelda. I'm like, Kyle, this is such a great map. So I'm all into the maps on those ones.
That's awesome. I didn't even make that connection that a lot of games literally have that kind of like cartography and maps and stuff built into them. Yeah.
Yes, it's so fun.
All right, Bob, did you have any questions today? Comments?
I would ask a question maybe of Skylar. Skylar, you really haven't talked that much about the art background, I guess, that you had. And the artistic talents, and that is something that's developed totally aside of the technical kinds of things you're doing with gaming. Is there some suggestions on how students and it really applies to both of you because of the things that you're doing. How has your beginning studies in art affected where you're at today?
Yeah, I could speak to this first. So I guess I just sort of blew by it, but during when I was sort of growing up, my parents took me to so let me back up. I was homeschooled up till 8th grade, and my parents took me to do like drawing classes and stuff as part of that, to do art for kind of get that artistic learning in homeschooling. And so I sort of learned how to draw and roughly paint at an early age. And then when I went to high school, I had an amazing art teacher. Mr. Hyde was a teacher over at Oswego Valley, who I was able to learn so much more from, and really kind of leveled up my drawing and general craftsmanship stuff. I think the amazing thing about the program there at Oswego Valley at that time was we got to do drawing, and we got to do photography, and we got to do sculpting, and we got to do pottery throwing. And it was just this amazing sort of broad education in arts and crafting that I think is pretty rare even in most high schools these days. I think that sort of create learning that you could, for me, it was never about specifically, I'm going to get a little philosophical here. It was never about specifically learning drawing or learning a specific craft. It was more about the creative mentality and the creative lifestyle was what I was interested in. And that's why, like, later on, sort of pivoting into the game career was not that big of a deal for me. I didn't feel like giving up a dream because I was always just sort of a maker person. And I was like good at drawing, and I was good at some of these other things, but more than anything, I've just always enjoyed making and crafting things. I mean, you can probably see in the background here, I have like puppets that I've made, and like I have like 3D pinning, and I paint little miniatures and stuff. I spend a lot of my time just like making and crafting things. And animation for me was always this, it's like a very physical art, particularly like the 2D animation, because it combines all these things. And you can probably tell that I'm like excited about it. I wish I could still do 2D animation, but I mean, for 2D animation back in the day, you have these big stacks of paper, and you're like at this desk with a light box shining through it, and you're doing a drawing, and you're flipping the paper, and you're doing another drawing, you're flipping the paper, and then you go to a machine that has like a down shooter, and you're doing photography, and then you're bringing it into a computer, and you're doing color correction and all. And there's all these cool steps to it that has made the process so sort of tangible and interesting to me, and just always kept me intrigued. And now we do 3D animation, and it's not quite as tangible, but it definitely still has like this sort of like problem solving makery aspect to it. I think a lot of people think of 3D animation as being a little bit more like technical and technology focused, and it definitely is. But really, for me, it all comes down to really enjoying just that sort of the fiddling aspect of it and the making aspect of it. And so I always say to like people who are interested in like animation or other creative fields, that the sort of key thing that I see about almost all the people who end up in these industries is that they have that, I don't want to, I know I said I was getting philosophical, but that like creative spark. And it's not about like their ability to be like incredibly good and insanely creative. It's more that interest in like making and creating things at any level, and often in many categories. A lot of the people that I worked with in the creative fields are similar people to me, who are like, yeah, they have this job, but they also spend all their time making stuff too. They have like Etsy shops and are knitting things and doing all sorts of crazy stuff. And so I encourage people to just try to engage with making things of any kind, and then try to figure out, if you want to get into one of those fields, what of those sort of things that you're making, things you're interested in, could you like apply to a job in the future? And that's kind of how I ended up where I am. Is it was like, oh, here's like an application to many of the things that I already like to do. And because of that, I don't want to act like it's never felt like work, but I've always like enjoyed my jobs that I have done, because it's always kind of related to the things that I like to do in my own free time too. So
I think that's an important part for both of you, that as educators, we tend to teach students concepts and facts and processes, but how do you teach creativity? And how do you create that spark in somebody, or that ability to look at the world constantly different, and to enjoy living in that abstract environment?
Yeah, and I think that for me is why like art programs are so important in high schools personally, is I think that most people are more creative than they think, but are not often given the tools and space to explore it. You give somebody a ball of clay, any kid in the world, and they'll make something amazing if you put it in their hands. And I think the same is true when you give people like basic art training and provide them with the tools to sort of explore. I think most people are more creative even than they think. I often hear a lot of adults say, I can't draw. Everyone can draw. It's just a matter of like how well you can do it and how well you've been trained to do it. And I think actually a lot of these artistic skills are very trainable. And I wouldn't even say that I'm like the most creative person. I actually really enjoy these sort of like technical methods in art. A lot of the work that I do, and even in my free time, like I paint Warhammer miniatures a lot. I'm not even that creative. I follow a tutorial on how to do it a lot of the times. And I love how it turns out because I really technically mastered this thing, right? And so I think people think you have to be like a creative genius or something to be in one of these creative fields. And it's just not true. A lot of it comes down to enjoying the processes and being interested in engaging with the tools. And I think if you give people those tools and teach them how to use them, most people could be creative if given the opportunity.
I agree. And I think I'd like to say you can be creative in almost any job that you are in. Like even me and my mom, we have to make flyers. And I'm like, Mom, I am putting on my resume that I am a flyer expert now because I have to make so many flyers for our programs that we do. And so that's just a way that you can pull in any creativity and make them look as nice and visually appealing as you want. And even in like meteorology, we had to make maps and be creative there too. So you could apply creativity to almost anything. And I think that we need to continue to help. I'm an arts proponent too. I'm always for the arts programs. So everyone needs to take art.
Yeah, I appreciate you both pointing that out. I run into a lot of students who get stuck on, they're like, I want to, be an artist and there's no jobs out there, in this rural area for me. But I think they need to think outside the box on how they can utilize that creative skill that they have in a different way. It doesn't have to just be drawing a picture every day, but utilizing that creative space in their mind in a different way. And I never really thought Kaitlyn of GIS as art and science, so that's a great connection. And Skylar, you also talked about the art and tech field kind of like joining together. So I'm definitely going to utilize what you guys told me when I'm talking with students more, especially the game developing. A lot of students are like, oh, I'm going to be a game developer, but you just show that there are multiple different areas of game developing. So now they need to kind of really figure out where in game developing do they fit. So that's so I'm so glad that you were able to join us today. It was very eye-opening, and I know that students are gonna really gain a lot of ideas from this and maybe help guide and direct them in a direction.
Thank you so much for having us. This was fun.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate you joining us. All right, so for students who are joining us next month on December 11th, we have Into the Woods, Careers in Forestry. So we have Matt Shank, an environmental educator with DCNR, and Joe Keller, a district forester with DCNR. So we hope that you guys join us in December. All right, thanks guys. Have a great day.